The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the weight of a storm that showed no mercy. Sheets of rain hammered against the cracked pavement, forming shallow rivers that rushed along the gutters. A flickering security camera buzzed weakly above a deserted alley, its hazy glow capturing a lone figure, a frail German shepherd limping through the darkness. His soaked fur clung to his trembling frame as he staggered forward, his breaths shallow and labored. Each step was agony. His ribs pressed painfully against his matted coat, his legs unsteady beneath him. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but it was the cold that threatened to claim him first. He had been running for what felt like days, running from what he no longer knew. But something deep inside urged him forward. There had to be something waiting for him. Someone. Miles away, Mark sat in the dim glow of his kitchen, the rain drumming against the window pane. His hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee, but he barely noticed the taste. His gaze lingered on nothing, lost in a haze of memory. Rex. The name was a whisper in his mind, a ghost of the past that refused to fade. His loyal partner, his best friend, gone. Mark exhaled sharply, gripping the table's edge as if grounding himself against the weight of regret. No matter how much time passed, the ache remained, clinging to him like a shadow. He had convinced himself that some wounds were never meant to heal. Love, once lost, was lost forever, or so he believed. But fate had other plans. The shepherd stumbled, his frail body swaying against the relentless wind. Rain blurred his vision, but he pressed on, instinct guiding his weakened steps. Meanwhile, Mark stood by the window, staring into the storm. A strange unease crept into his chest, a whisper of something unknown. He didn't know why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something, someone, was out there, and that somehow his life was about to change forever. The wind howled through the empty streets, rattling windows and tearing through the trees like an invisible beast. Mark pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders as he reached for the light switch. Then he heard it. A sound. Faint. Weak. A cry swallowed by the storm. Mark froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the usual creak of the old house settling. No, this was something else, something alive. A soft whimper, barely audible through the howling storm, but enough to send an unexpected chill down his spine. His heart pounded against his ribs. It had been years since he had heard a sound like that. And the last time he had lost everything. Mark stood motionless, his hand hovering over the doorknob. His rational mind screamed at him to stay inside, to ignore it. It wasn't his problem. But something deep inside, something raw and unshakable, begged him to act. He clenched his jaw. He had sworn to never go down this road again. He had promised himself he wouldn't care. Not after what happened to Rex. His fingers tightened around the knob. One step, just one. Before he could talk himself out of it, he cracked open the door. The icy wind slammed into him, cutting through his clothes like shards of glass. Mark raised a shaking hand, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Then he saw her. A German shepherd, motionless in the snow. Her frail body was curled in on itself, her ribs visible even beneath her soaked, matted fur. Each breath she took was shallow, labored. Snowflakes clung to her face, melting into the warmth of her barely there life. Mark swallowed hard. She was dying. Mark knelt beside her, his fingers brushing against her damp fur. The dog didn't stir. His eyes fell to the tattered collar around her neck. Faded. Torn. But still there. He turned it over, his breath catching when he saw the rusted tag dangling from it. The engraving was barely legible, but it was enough to make his chest tighten. This wasn't just some stray, she belonged to someone, or she used to. The sight of her, so weak, so helpless, sent Mark tumbling backward in time. He was there again. The open field, the chaos, the gunshot. Rex, his loyal partner, his best friend, lying still beneath his hands, blood soaking into the earth. His desperate pleas falling on deaf ears. His chest constricted, the pain just as sharp as it had been that day. Mark blinked hard, forcing himself back to the present. But the past wasn't done with him yet. Every part of him screamed to turn away, to walk back inside, shut the door, and forget he had ever heard that cry. He had saved one before, and he had lost him. He couldn't go through that again. But then the dog shivered, a small broken sound escaping her throat. Mark exhaled, slow and heavy. Damn it. He reached down, his fingers sliding beneath her frail body. She barely weighed anything. Nothing but bones and memories. As he lifted her into his arms, she let out a small, exhausted sigh, her head resting weakly against his chest. Mark hesitated in the doorway. The storm raged behind him, but inside, the fire flickered, warm, waiting. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, closing the door behind him. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. The dog lay curled on a blanket beside the fire, her body rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. Mark sat on the floor, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at her. He had saved her, but for how long? His hands balled into fists. He had told himself he wouldn't do this again. He wasn't strong enough to lose another. And yet, as he watched her breathe, the warmth of the fire reflected in her dull, tired eyes. Mark realized he had already made his choice. Mark sat in the dimly lit examination room, his fingers gripping the edge of the chair as the vet spoke. Severe malnourishment, dehydration. He's been fighting to survive for a long time. The vet's voice was heavy with concern. Even with proper care, there's no guarantee. His body might not recover. Mark felt his stomach twist. He had only known the dog for a day, yet the thought of losing him now felt unbearable. He looked down at the frail figure curled up on the exam table, ribs pressing against thin skin. Shadow had fought so hard. Was it already too late? On the ride home, the dog sat curled on the passenger seat, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. Mark exhaled sharply. I don't even know what to call you. The dog turned his head slightly as if waiting. Mark hesitated before murmuring, Shadow. The name felt right. He was quiet, lingering just behind him like a presence Mark hadn't realized he needed. The dog didn't react at first, but when they reached home he followed Mark inside without hesitation, settling at his feet. Days passed, and though Shadow was weak, he never left Mark's side. He would wait by the bathroom door when Mark showered, curl at the foot of the bed at night, and rest his head on Mark's knee when exhaustion overtook him. Mark found himself reaching down absent-mindedly, fingers brushing against Shadow's coarse fur. He wasn't sure who was comforting who, but the silence between them was something sacred. Trust was growing, not in grand gestures but in the quiet moments in between. One evening, Mark absent-mindedly tossed a tennis ball across the room. Shadow didn't hesitate. He caught it midair with precise coordination, dropping it neatly at Mark's feet. Mark blinked. That was weird. Testing a theory, he stood and gave a firm, sit. Shadow obeyed instantly. Stay. The dog froze, unmoving. Mark's chest tightened. Shadow hadn't just been a pet, he had been trained. But for what? And by whom? Curiosity gnawed at Mark. Late at night, he scoured lost pet databases, but nothing matched. Then, on a hunch, he searched missing canine reports. And there it was. Mark's pulse pounded. A police dog, a partner. Someone had loved him, worked beside him, and lost him. His gaze flickered to Shadow, sleeping by the fireplace. He wasn't just any dog. He had a past, a purpose. But what had happened to him? Mark sat motionless, staring at the report. If Shadow was really Axel, did someone still believe he was out there? Did someone still miss him? His throat tightened. He had only just started to heal, only just begun to let this dog into his life. But if there was a family out there, waiting, could he really keep him? He looked over at Shadow, who stirred, lifting his head. Mark exhaled. The truth was heavy, and he wasn't ready to face it yet. Despite the questions weighing on him, Mark knew one thing: Shadow needed him. And maybe, just maybe, he needed Shadow too. He found himself talking more, not just to the dog, but to the memories that haunted him. About Rex, his own fallen partner. About the guilt, the regret, the pain that never truly faded. Shadow listened, unwavering. And in the quiet moments, in the gentle nudges and steady presence, Mark felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. For the first time in years, Mark felt at peace. Shadow, Axel, had given him something to hold on to, but peace never lasted long. One evening, as Mark sifted through old news reports, his breath caught. A name, a face, a case tied to Axel's disappearance. His hands trembled. He had thought this was just a rescue, a second chance, but something darker was at play, and whatever had happened to Axel 5 years ago wasn't over yet. Mark's phone buzzed, interrupting the quiet hum of the television. He barely glanced at the screen before answering. Mark? The voice on the other end was familiar, gravelly, aged by years of experience. Detective Reed. What's going on? Mark asked, his chest tightening. There was a pause, then Reed spoke, his tone heavy. It's about your dog. Mark's grip on the phone tightened. What about him? Reed exhaled. I think you need to sit down for this. Mark's breath hitched as Reed unraveled the truth. Axel wasn't just lost, Reed said grimly. He was stolen. Mark's pulse pounded. Stolen? We never made it public, but 5 years ago Axel vanished from the K9 unit. We found leads, whispers about illegal fights, brutal underground circuits where dogs were tested. But by the time we got close, the trail had gone cold. Mark's eyes flicked to Shadow, no, Axel, curled up on the couch, his scarred body rising and falling with each breath. They broke him, Mark whispered, rage bubbling beneath his skin. Reed hesitated. We don't know everything, but we do know one thing. Someone out there still wants him. Mark ended the call, staring blankly at the floor. His mind swirled with questions, but one thought eclipsed all others. What now? Axel belonged to the Force. Legally, he should go back. But after everything, hadn't he earned peace? Mark's hands clenched into fists. Returning, Axel meant exposing him to a past he barely survived. Keeping him meant going against the law. Axel stirred in his sleep, a soft whimper escaping him. Mark sighed. What do I do, buddy? That night, unease clung to Mark like a second skin. The air felt heavier, the silence too thick. Then a noise. Footsteps, slow, calculated. Mark tensed, his eyes flicking toward the door. He wasn't alone. Axel lifted his head, ears perked. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Mark's gut twisted. Someone was out there, watching. He moved toward the window, heart hammering. A shadow loomed near the fence, still, waiting. Mark's stomach dropped. This wasn't over. The doorknob rattled. A sharp click. Someone was trying to get in. Mark reached for the nearest object, a heavy flashlight. His pulse pounded in his ears. Then Axel rose. He wasn't strong, wasn't fast, but his body stiffened with purpose. His growl deepened, lips curling back. The intruder hesitated. Mark's breath caught. They weren't after him. They were after Axel. The door creaked as the lock gave way. Mark barely had time to react before the silhouette pushed inside. Axel lunged, not with youthful strength, but with raw instinct. His frail body trembled, but his spirit did not. The intruder stumbled back, shock flashing across his face as Axel's snarling form closed in. Mark flicked on the flashlight, aiming it at the intruder's face. "Get the hell out!" Axel barked, loud and sharp. For the first time, the predator looked afraid. The man hesitated for half a second, then bolted. Axel lurched forward, teeth bared, sending him crashing through the door. Mark rushed after him, but by the time he reached the porch, the man was gone, swallowed by the night. Mark turned to Axel, who stood panting, legs trembling, but head held high. "You scared him off, boy," Mark murmured, crouching down. "You saved us." Axel pressed his head against Mark's chest. Mark wrapped his arms around Axel, feeling the dog's tired but steady heartbeat. "You don't have to fight anymore," he whispered. Axel sighed, his body heavy with exhaustion. But in that moment, Mark knew Axel had chosen him. The world may have broken him once, but here, now, he wasn't just a survivor. He was home, and Mark had finally made his choice. Mark inhaled deeply, gripping his phone as he dialed Detective Reed. His voice was steady, but his heart pounded. "I want to adopt him," he said. "Axel deserves to live out his days with someone who loves him." There was silence on the other end. Then Reed sighed. "You're sure about this, Mark?" Mark glanced down at Axel, curled up at his feet. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." 2 days later, the decision was final. The police understood. Axel was too weak to return to service. His battle scars told a story of survival, and he had nothing left to prove. Mark knelt beside him, running a gentle hand over his fur. "You're home, buddy. No more running, no more fighting, just us." Axel lifted his head, his tired eyes softening as if he finally understood. The days that followed were filled with everything Axel had been denied for so long. Peace, warmth, and love. Mark took him on slow walks in the park, letting him sniff the fresh air. Every meal was prepared with care, no longer just scraps to survive on. And every night Mark sat beside him, stroking his fur, whispering words of reassurance. Axel was no longer just a survivor. He was family. That night Mark lay awake, listening to Axel's steady breathing beside him. He reached down, resting a hand on his companion's back. For years, Axel had known nothing but war. First as a canine, then as a fighter. But now, in the quiet of Mark's home, he was finally at peace. "Sleep well, old boy. You're safe now." The morning light filtered through the curtains. Mark stretched, then reached out to ruffle Axel's fur like he always did. But the dog didn't stir. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He pressed a hand to Axel's chest. No movement, no heartbeat. A lump rose in his throat, but he didn't break. Not yet. He just sat there, running his fingers through Axel's fur, whispering, "You made it home." Tears welled in Mark's eyes, but through them he smiled. Axel had fought long enough. He had loved, and he had been loved. That was all that mattered. Mark wrapped a blanket around Axel's still body, his fingers trembling. "Rest now, buddy. You've earned it." He sat beside him a while longer, the weight of loss heavy, but so was the gratitude for the time they had. Weeks passed, but Mark's home felt empty. The silence was deafening. Then, one evening, he found himself standing outside a local animal shelter. Through the glass, he saw them, dogs of all sizes, waiting, hoping. A small, trembling pup caught his eye. Mark stepped inside. "Hey there, little guy," he murmured, reaching out. He smiled softly. He couldn't save Axel's past, but he could change another dog's future. And maybe, just maybe, his own. Mark sat on his porch, Axel's old collar resting in his hands. The once abandoned dog had found love in his final days, and in doing so had given Mark something too, a sense of purpose. Axel's story wasn't just about survival. It was proof that redemption could come from the most unexpected places. Axel had been tossed aside, deemed unworthy, yet in the end he had known more love than many ever would. Mark smiled through his grief, knowing that no soul, not a man, not a dog, was ever beyond saving. Love had transformed Axel's final days, and in turn, changed Mark forever. Mark had spent years building walls around his heart, afraid to feel the sting of loss again. But Axel had torn those walls down, not with words, but with unwavering loyalty. True healing, Mark realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about having the courage to love again. Axel's journey had started in abandonment, but it hadn't ended there. He had found warmth, companionship, and a love that had lasted beyond his final breath. As Mark stood by the shelter's door, ready to save another life, he understood home wasn't a place. It was love.